Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Fernandez, welcome. Today we'll hear directly from the FTA on implementation of last year's infrastructure law. As I've stated before, we shouldn't pay for an infrastructure package by borrowing billions more dollars, but that's precisely what happened with this law. It authorized so much new spending that $118 billion had to be transferred from the Treasury's general fund to the Highway Trust Fund, which is a specific account financed with federal gas tax revenue, to cover mass transit and highway construction costs. President Biden would make this shortfall worse by suspending the federal gas tax for 3 months, reasoning that the solution to high gas prices isn't more supply, but rather more debt. I'd suggest if we want to help commuters and families suffering from inflation, we could start by reversing the administration's actions that keep us from using America's own fossil energy. But back to infrastructure. Federal spending certainly should be driven by a reasoned assessment of our nation's needs. However, last year's infrastructure law seems in many ways to have been driven more by Democratic political imperatives. The bill funneled billions to projects that the private sector has been more than willing to fund, such as ferries and electric vehicle charging stations. Transit was given $108.1 billion over a 5-year period. Now, to put that number into perspective, it's almost twice what transit got in the last surface transportation reauthorization. And this staggering sum is on top of the nearly $85 billion given to transit during just 1 year of the COVID pandemic. The vast majority of that money characterized as emergency spending to offset COVID losses. In fact, that nearly $85 billion exceeded the combined annual operating and capital costs of all transit agencies in the United States of America combined. And at the time, Democrats tried to justify paying for more than 100% of transit agency budgets by saying that transit systems would collapse from declines in ridership and a collapse in state and local tax revenues. Except that state and local tax collection set an all-time new record in 2020, which was then exceeded in 2021. And on top of this all-time record tax revenue collected by state and local governments, Congress gave states more than $850 billion to deal with COVID relief issues. Worse still, billions of dollars will go to transit agencies that were facing systemic ridership declines well before COVID. Since reaching a high of 10.7 billion trips in 2014, transit ridership has steadily fallen. It fell by almost 8% in 2019 alone, before COVID. In the last 2 years saw much steeper declines. Ridership fell at some agencies by over 70%. According to FTA, ridership now is only about 60% of pre-pandemic levels. Some estimates predict ridership will never fully return to pre-pandemic levels. Agency leaders in New York, Pittsburgh, Washington have all said many of their riders simply won't return. And even transit agencies that are predicting ridership to return to pre-pandemic levels don't expect that to happen this decade. So why give away still more taxpayer money to agencies serving far fewer riders? Well, shockingly, the FTA is allowing transit agencies that are seeking federal funding for projects to expand transit systems to use pre-pandemic ridership data from 2019. Transit agencies' largest source for expansion projects is FTA's Capital Investment Grants Program, known as CIG. Now, there are transit agencies seeking millions and even billions of federal taxpayer funding for CIG projects to expand streetcars, commuter rail, light rail, bus rapid transit. And to justify their funding request, FTA has been allowing these transit agencies to use pre-pandemic data on ridership from 2019 and 2020. This boggles the mind. Transit ridership was already in decline pre-COVID, and transit agencies are publicly admitting that their ridership will not recover to pre-pandemic levels for over a decade, if ever. So federal taxpayers will build out transit system expansions to serve ghost riders, which of course will also have the effect of increasing long-term maintenance backlogs. I have no doubt that a few years after these projects are completed, transit agencies will come back to Congress pleading for still more subsidies to operate systems that have become far too large for the demand. Also concerning is FTA's willful disregard of an important feature of last year's infrastructure law. The law requires agencies to make progress on their deferred maintenance backlogs in order to qualify for CIG grants. But FTA allows or plans to allow agencies to qualify for CIG grants even when they are actually falling further behind on their overall deferred maintenance targets. That's no way to protect taxpayers nor to follow the law. And speaking of protecting taxpayers, people should feel safe while using transit. As I stated at our last transit hearing, the rising rates of crime on transit systems are deeply disturbing. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that FDA is taking this issue nearly seriously enough. Let me conclude with this observation. I understand it is certainly not entirely transit agencies' fault that some people are choosing not to use their services. But that doesn't mean that Congress should be throwing even more billions of federal taxpayer dollars at them to build out more services for riders they don't have. I look forward to discussing the future of mass transit today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes Administrator Fernandez.